So everyone at home, just log in. I'll have, like we did for test, just have your class ready to go. And you'll type it in on the assignments page type it in for like an assignment on Teams or post it on Teams. So it will post as an assignment, a big assignment, because it's a test. Any other questions? Oops. So the format for the body paragraphs, topic sentence, and make sure, so the format for the body paragraphs, the topic sentence, make sure that topic is in your blueprint of your thesis. So it's a nice flowing essay. So it's very clear where you're going. And then let me move my computer around. I have to move my little station here. And then you can do one of two ways. The first way is you can just start with explain the purpose of your first document and related to a fact that you know, some backstory, outside information, followed by a citation. You can do that for two documents, and then add one more example from your knowledge. And so you could do it that way, or start with an example from your knowledge and then do the two documents. But that's the basic format. So topic, and then you start with topic sentence. Oh, sorry, almost forgot one thing. Quick explanation of what that is, and then the document, your outside information, or you can start with your outside information in two documents. I kind of like the your outside information and then add two additional documents showing the purpose. Do not summarize it. I would like that one for me personally, but you can do it either way. Any other questions? And don't forget, this is it should be on your screen right now. Your question will be: evaluate the following statement. The ultimate cause of the Civil War was sectional differences over slavery. And I like questions like that. I just think they're easier to take a stand and go from there. And no more questions. If you think of something, drop me a note, because I'll be off and on all day today. But don't forget, then tomorrow, first period, we log on, we get going, and you only have the period. Yes, if you're finishing a last sentence or two, I'll let you finish it, but that's it. We got to go. You have to be done. And that's why I'm letting you be organized and prepared. And the thing about DBQ, it's a little more work. In a way, it's easier. In a way, it's harder. I know that's the way life is. But I really want you to go in there knowing exactly what you're doing, or a pretty good idea, so you feel good writing about it. Now, I want this to be good. Oh, question? Maybe? The DBQ is tomorrow. So the DBQ is tomorrow. So I've gone through your example, especially in that context. Think about all the things we've talked about that led up to this Civil War, from Manifest Destiny, Texas, Mexican War, Wilmot Proviso, Compromise of 1850, Uncle Tom's Cabin, filibusters, Kansas-Nebraska Act. All of those things can be used in context in your first 2 or 3 sentences of your opening paragraph. Then you write your thesis. And then you have all kinds of evidence to prove your point. If you believe that slavery caused it, or you believe it's maybe a couple reasons, But got to be honest with you, it's hard to get around the slavery causing the Civil War. I'm just telling you, we'll get to that today. Any more questions? All right. Let us begin. So I'm not going to go through a lot about all the details about the beginnings of the war, but when we quit, I talked about John Brown, how John Brown just totally divided the nation, totally divided. And, oops, sorry about that. It's not showing up on my, give me a sec. So hopefully you see the screen. Oh, Scott, good question. If you run out of time, it's okay to skip this conclusion. Yeah, that is the paragraph. If you have to skip on a paragraph, skip on the conclusion. I mean, of course, I would prefer you write some kind of conclusion, but the big thing are the body paragraphs and the opening paragraph. So if you have to skip on one, I don't want you to go into thinking, I'm just not going to write it, the hell with it. Try to get it done, but if the clock, you only got a few minutes left, finish that body paragraph. That's the key. Now, that's for a timed essay. You know, if you're in another class where you have plenty of time to write and rewrite, you don't want to, you want to finish strong. Timed essay, different thing. And we got to focus on timed essays in this class, just the nature of the beast. So we talked about the election of 1860. I showed you those great pictures. Everybody saw the ham on the stick. And don't forget, the Democrats were fatally split. Breckinridge and Douglas split the Democratic Party, Northern and Southern, and Southern was states' rights. Bell ran out of the Constitutional Union Party. In fact, that's why I want to go back to this picture right here. Here's Douglas, Breckinridge, Bell's Constitutional Union. And so Lincoln just couldn't screw up. He's breathing and functioning. And he'll probably be president. This happened a couple times in history. You know, for example, you could say 1912, Woodrow Wilson. The Republicans were split. So that's another time it happened in the exact opposite way. And I think I showed you some of the cartoons. This is one of my favorites, the Lincoln with a ham on a stick. And getting to the White House. And don't forget, all Southerners looked at Lincoln as part of a conspiracy to destroy them, and he's a John Brown. And ideologies are so important. I mean, there's one thing that tied together all the reasons that led to Civil War. It's ideology. They both had different points of view about what happened with the election, what happened with Dred Scott, what happened with Kansas, Nebraska, what happened with Bleeding Kansas. They saw it from two different angles. And that would be such an important reason for secession, especially for the South, because they're the ones who started it. And so we're jumping right to, we got the so those of you who missed it, fourth period, I didn't quite get to this. Wide Awakes were Republicans who took a very militaristic pose to this. They marched through the streets. They carried these torches that were shaped like, made in such a way that they look like an eye from a distance. And the whole point is they're going to stand up to Southern bullying, the Wide Awakes. But this also shows that both sides are ready for war, but Southerners, who are incredibly militaristic, took this as a massive threat. You know, we're militaristic to defend ourselves, and thus we have to defend ourselves from you. And it was a scary time. And part of things that are happening more and more is that it happened so fast for the Republicans and the Democrats. They went from being parties that represented ideologies and we're going to do stuff and change the country to this is our club. And I don't care what it stands for. They became very nationalistic to their parties. So there's the election. Lincoln would win. Breckinridge and Douglas split the vote. Douglas got a lot of votes, but he was always in that second place. Bell got a lot of votes. And you can see this. There was New Jersey, for example, was pretty strong Democratic feeling. In fact, there were still slaves in New Jersey. There were still a few slaves in New York and Illinois. Just because there weren't slave codes didn't mean there wasn't slavery. And that's where we get to secession. And this is right where I got to, I think, first period, third period didn't quite get to this, and fourth period didn't get here. Secession. December 20th, 1860. Charleston rushed to secession because many were convinced Georgia would beat them to it. Outright lie by secessionists, or as they called it, secessionitis, like a disease. And just a month and a half afterwards, they wanted it done before the election of 1860. And as they looked at it, this is like the successor of this idea of nullification. And this goes back to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions way back in 1798 for the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Hartford Convention, and then the biggie nullification. This is this culmination. The fire eaters got their way. And so just to review the main reasons. First off, the fear of a congressional minority by the pro-slavery South. They could see a future where the House of Representatives will be overwhelmingly from free states, and there's now an imbalance in the Senate. There are more free states. Next, all free soilers are John Brown, something I emphasize a lot. So all free soilers are John Brown, and this is a big one that most people don't talk about today, but it was talked about all the time then. There was no Republican Party in the South, but with President Lincoln, there could be a Republican Party. Lincoln could create a Republican Party in the South. If you just write Republican Party in the South, you're going to be totally baffled by what you wrote about in 1 hour. Make sure you put down that Lincoln could create it, a Republican Party in the South. The big thing about notes and PowerPoints, just write the main points. Is your job to get in the context, so to speak. And they saw it like a Trojan horse. We talked about what a Trojan horse was. But what Lincoln could do was Lincoln could appoint government officials. Remember the spoils system with Andrew Jackson? They could appoint all these government jobs and give them to Republicans, or give them to people willing to become Republicans in the South, creating a cadre of free soil Republicans within the South to undermine their system. As they saw it, they could trigger a series of events like, political defeats, beginnings of curtailing slave codes, or of course even slave rebellion. This Trojan horse, they could create a Republican Party. And this is an important thought process to the secessionists. If we allow this, we're going to get weaker and weaker. Remember, they already realized by 1856 we're weak. That was proven in 1860. And now they're looking at it like, if we don't act now, the Republican Party will be created 3 or 4 years down the road, and we're doomed. We will never have another chance again. Never again. And I should type that in. But let me get to the next one and I'll see. Sorry. Oh, government jobs. I forgot I typed this in. Remember, the president can create government jobs, and that's called patronage. And so Lincoln created all these government jobs. And so what the South was looking at this was a preventative war. We have no choice but to do it, because someday down the road, they'll get us. Someday. So, a just and defensive war as they saw it. As they saw, we're just defending ourselves against Northern aggression. Now, let's be clear about it. There has been no direct Northern aggression. The Northern aggression is in their mind. It's in their ideology. John Brown did not represent the North. Yes, many Northerners liked John Brown's body, the song, and thought he was standing up to it, but they didn't attack him. That was an incredibly isolated event. As they saw, we'll never have another chance. We must fight. And this just and defensive war against a potential enemy is a scary cause for war, because this is exactly the reason that Germany, Imperial Germany, would go through a series of events starting World War I. And this would be the exact reason that Hitler and Nazi Germany felt they had no choice to go to war, because we must stop the threat of the communists and the socialists. They were rabidly anti-socialist and anti-communist in Nazi Germany, well, Nazis were. And This is what they're thinking. And in fact, in the UN Charter, which is a treaty that the US would sign, preventative wars are now illegal by international law and therefore by US law because it's a treaty. And this preventative war, though, will be the justification for the US attacking Iraq in 2003. Someday they might get weapons of mass destruction. This is a dangerous moment. And so with that, all these other states started going. And here's one of my favorites. Here is the Pickens was the governor of South Carolina, and this is an anti-secession. It's South Carolina's ultimatum about Lincoln, and he's setting off the cannon, and look where it's aimed. And there's Buchanan basically trying to stop him, but it's called the Peacemaker. That's the cannon, the name of the cannon that blew up Abel Upshur. So that's the reference. And I do like this one. Secessionists said, oh, we'll break away with the Union by cutting off our ties, and what's going to happen? Clever one, but let's be clear about it. The secessionists had a pretty clear advantage. They called it Secessionitis. Pretty soon, all of the Deep South followed. And if you look at this, the dates, the state with the most slaves seceded first. The state with the second most slaves seceded second. And then all the rest of the Deep South, which had the highest percentage of slaves, seceded. Texas hesitated, but then by February, they seceded. And if you look at this, the Upper South, the states in purple, they delayed. They didn't have a highest percentage of slaves. Their secessionitis wasn't quite as strong. They felt a little bullied by South Carolina to secede, but they were waiting for the reaction of the United States. So the Upper South. But there's going to be a lot of debate about this, about why the United States split apart and the South started the Civil War. But let's be very clear about it. In 1861, everybody knew what it was. Everybody knew. Here are two states, documents from two states. Oh, by the way, the Secessionist Quick Step, this song, it's actually a pretty good song. But South Carolina and Mississippi, the first two states, and these are excerpts, and one of them is used in your DBQ, that give the reason why they seceded. So the first one, the Declaration of the Immediate Causes, to which induced and justified secession of South Carolina. And it says, if you can't read it at home, an increasing hostility on the part of non-slavery states, non-slaveholding states to the institution of slavery. It says more about this, but it makes very clear. Slavery was the reason South Carolina seceded, as they sought all these steps by the North. And remember, we talked about free soil, they saw as a direct threat. Congressional minority, condemning the slave rebellion, go on and on. Institution of slavery. Mississippi, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world, material as profit making, think in terms of material profit. If labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest, most important portions of the commerce of the earth, a blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. And so what they're saying is the North is attacking civilization. This is dripping with the positive good theory of slavery. They make it very clear. The vice president, Alexander Stephens, or the vice president of New Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, we'll come to him in a sec, or come to the creation of the government in a second. Stephens would say the Confederacy formed on the great truth that the white man or the black man is inferior to the white man. And they made it very clear. It was slavery. So remember I told you about HAP. I told you that little thing you have to do for half of your documents. And they call it HAP. This is something I picked up from this training I had to do years ago. Actually, it was about 7 or 8 years ago for the AP exam. And I'm just looking for, I think it's a little hoop, like a hoop, but it's things we got to do to pass the test. That's the way life is. Historical context or content means the same thing. Audience, purpose, or point of view. So perhaps documents, you must explain why this bias or the documents have this. And so following the template, bank believes blank because of, let's look at document A. Ooh, something happened here. Give me a sec. Huh. That's weird. There we go. So you must have one sentence, basic template. Bank believes, or if it's a picture, shows blank because of. And so document A, and I throw document A on there because it shows South Carolina Ordinance of Secession. A geographical line has been drawn across the Union, and all states north of that line have united in the election of a man to the high office of the President of the United States whose opinions and purpose are hostile to slavery. They're talking about Lincoln. He is to be entrusted with the administration of the common government because he has declared that government cannot endure permanently, half slave or half free, and that the public mind must rest in the belief that slavery is the course of ultimate distinction. A very weird way of saying that they elected somebody who's going to get rid of slavery. That is what, so let's say that's a document. I just gave document A. That is the South Carolina Ordinance of Secession. And so I'll let you give you a second to look through the document. If you were doing the HAP, oops, sorry about that. Here it is. South Carolina believes it has no choice but to secede. So South Carolina, so that's South Carolina. Okay, South Carolina believes it has no choice but to secede. So it has no choice but to secede because of a threat of a free soil president had to the system of slavery in the South. So there I laid out, that kind of talks about purpose. I even add some historical context or point of view. You need one of those four things. You don't need them all, just one example of them. Historical context or purpose or point of view or audience. I'm a big believer in purpose or historical content. To me, I always think in terms of historical content, but that's an example of the one sentence. Blank believes this, blank, because of. Or you could just say that the South Carolina feared a free soil president. Or you could say that South Carolina believed the Republican Party were all free soilers. So that is an example of how to do that. Give me a sec. What the heck? All right, so with that, here's a great thing about video. You can stop it and go back and look. So the thing about this is, when you start looking about why they went to Civil War and all of this happened, there are a heck of a lot more similarities than there are differences. I mean, look at all these similarities. Both the North and the South have a common language. Having different languages has always been one of the big causes of civil war, especially looking at European history or look at some of the most bloody civil wars. When I mean language also fits in, and let me type this in. Ethnicity. Ethnicity too, your ethnic background. You know, some of the most bloody civil wars in the last, well, in my lifetime, for example, like in the Balkan states, the former Yugoslavia, were ethnic and language lines. The horrific genocide in Rwanda was based upon language and ethnic differences. And so there are differences there. Well, that didn't really exist. Most people spoke English, so to speak. I know if you get someone from Boston and someone from South Carolina, it seems like, what countries are you from? Most citizens of the United States were Christian, different sects, but, and there was a lot of anti-Catholic bias, but Christian. They both operated in the same basic financial system with a money system, problematic, but a money system created by the federal government. Both looked at George Washington as their founding father, the Declaration of Independence as their founding document. That's a pretty similar history. Identity, both looked at themselves as Americans. We are Americans, both North and South. Citizens of the US said, we are Americans. But what was the difference? The big difference was the belief and value system around slavery. The belief and value system. And I have to add this because don't forget, even though a significant number of Northerners were abolitionists, the vast majority were free soilers and not necessarily opposed to slavery. They had a different belief system on what slavery would do. Yeah, there's a lot of moral problems both North and the South. But ideology about slavery. So make sure you add that about slavery. And so with that, here's Buck Buchanan. And Buck Buchanan is still president of the United States. James Buchanan is still in office. And remember, the election is November. And unlike today, the inauguration is March 3rd, 1861. 5 months. And in those 5 months, the country dissolved into civil war because of the inaction. Okay, I shouldn't blame Buck Buchanan. And yes, that's Buck Buchanan in Super Bowl I. There's Buck Buchanan. I know, the most eligible bachelor in America. So, he's still president. Abraham Lincoln is much like Joe Biden is today. He's the president-elect. He has no power. And he's desperate to not have civil war. But more importantly, he's desperate to make sure there's still a government when he gets there. And so Lincoln has no power. They're president-elect. You'll see a very similar thing happen in 1932-33, where Herbert Hoover is still president and the country is literally falling apart. And Franklin Roosevelt won't come into office on March 3rd. A very similar thing where it could have ended right there. Buchanan showed his problematic approach and why he's considered one of the worst presidents in history. He made a very strong statement when South Carolina seceded. It is unconstitutional to secede. Sounding a little like Andrew Jackson at first. And this caused a few other southern states pause. But then he added the qualifier. But it's unconstitutional to stop them. We can't do anything about it. They're going to secede, and that's the way it goes. Yeah, not exactly a strong stance by Buchanan there. In fact, can you think of anything weaker? You can't do this, so quit, but I'm not going to stop you. A disastrous outcome. And then he ordered, almost all, except for 3, but most federal installations to be abandoned in the South. When I mean federal installations, I mean we had a tiny United States Army, but virtually all the Army was sent home or sent back to the North. Same with naval bases, except for a couple forts, but also like post offices or customs houses where they collected tariffs. They shut them all down and they pulled back. So basically Buchanan, to avoid conflict, and maybe this might have been the right choice, but it was a dramatic sign of weakness, which encouraged secessionitis. They're not going to stop us. Let's do it. Contrast that with Andrew Jackson, who said, I will personally lead an army to stop the traitors and hang them all. A big difference. And so almost immediately compromise started. And there were 2 potential compromises. The Crittenden Compromise, John J. Crittenden of Kentucky, was to extend 3630 to the sea. So basically make California half slave, half free too. That blew up in the House and the Senate before, when Lincoln was still back in Springfield, Illinois. Another one was a potential 13th Amendment. And the 13th Amendment would give a constitutional guarantee to slavery, basically telling the Southerners, even though you have a free soiler, slavery will be protected in the South. And basically, Republicans said, we're free soil. We're not going to say slavery will be constitutional because we don't want slavery in our territories or states. And so this died. And this is going to be one of the great ironies. The 13th Amendment, when it would be ratified, would be the one banning slavery. So that's ironic. The 13th Amendment that happened before didn't happen. Crittenden is a classic example of what's going to happen with the Civil War. Crittenden was from Kentucky, a border state that stayed loyal to the Union, but a lot of Kentuckians joined the Confederacy. His sons, he had two sons that joined the Confederacy and one son that joined the Union. He stayed loyal to the Union. It showed that this really was a civil war. So let's get to the Confederacy. The Confederacy itself, when they seceded, they would eventually choose former Army officer. Remember, he was Zachary Taylor's son-in-law. His first wife passed away, so he was remarried. But former West Point graduate and Army officer Jefferson Davis, he would become a senator, Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis. And Davis was a reluctant secessionist, but he was from Mississippi, and he was appointed provisional president. They made Mobile, Alabama, the capital of the Confederacy, but it had to be Virginia. They needed to get Virginia into the Confederacy. It was the richest, the most populous state. So as soon as Virginia is going to come in, they're going to move the capital to Virginia. So we'll come back to that. But it's going to be in Mobile. And their program was immediately King Cotton diplomacy. That became the essence of it. Even before they had their first provisional election, they did write a constitution loosely based on the U.S. Constitution. And banning the international slave trade because it was so horrible, but protecting slavery. And so that's Jefferson Davis. King Cotton diplomacy was his idea that cotton was king, and Britain and France, but especially Britain, desperately needed it for its textile mills. So they're going to embargo cotton from Britain and France, deprive Britain and France of cotton, and then this is what you have to get. Hopefully force, and I'll type this in because it's so weird. And force Britain into the war. Force Britain into the war. And this cartoon shows it. The thought was right here. Britain, even though they're the country opposed to slavery, needed cotton so much for their textile mills, they would join the war, and with their powerful fleet, the South could win. And here is showing, this is actually because of the British blockade, but no more cotton for Britain. This is Britain. And this horrifically racist cartoon, remember those pictures of the awful Cuffies and Sambos, and showing no more slaves, states can't send you any more cotton. But that's what they're hoping. And so the first year of the war, they wouldn't trade with Britain. And I want to be very, very clear about this. Add this to your notes. This was a complete and unmitigated disaster. It failed so bad for the Confederacy that they never recovered. They should have started trading cotton immediately, because that would have gave them a chance to get hard cash that they could have used to buy British weapons, and that could have turned the tide of the war. Instead, by not trading with Britain for a year, by the time they realized what a disaster King Cotton diplomacy was, it was too late. The Union had built a navy and were blockading the South. This was a disaster. Foolish hubris by the South. If they would have not done this, they very well could have won the war. And we would have a totally different course of history. Let's just put it this way. You wouldn't have to be worried about the AP exam, as you know, because it would be totally different. But let's get back to this then. And so with that, let's go right here. Lincoln would be inaugurated as the country is literally falling apart. literally falling apart. And I love this couple pictures of the first inauguration. They had to sneak Lincoln in because of threat of assassination. And Maryland was a border state. Maryland was still a slave state. And they had to go through Maryland to get to Washington, D.C. In fact, Baltimore, the railroad, the Baltimore to Ohio Railroad, stopped at the north end of Baltimore. The Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad, the RF&P, started in the south end of Baltimore. So they had to walk through Baltimore. Lincoln walked through Baltimore through a hostile pro-Confederate crowd to get him to Washington, D.C. So they actually snuck him through in the middle of the night, protected with a shawl around him so they could disguise him. Immediately, Confederates said this was meant to be a big insult that showed you how things were at the time, that he was dressed as a woman and therefore not a real man to become president. But anyways, they got him for the first inauguration. And here you can see the rotunda. The smaller rotunda had been replaced by they're replacing it with a much bigger rotunda, the rotunda that's on the Capitol today. And they were building it during the Civil War. And I love that picture with the scaffolding and the crane, see it being built. And once they finish it, the U.S. Capitol will be an almost exact smaller copy of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. And so here's Lincoln being inaugurated. And let me give you just a little bit of this inauguration speech, because he has a serious problem. There are no federal troops in the South. If he acts too strong, the Upper South will join, but it also might break apart the North. Lincoln has to navigate a maze. And so in it, he lays out a couple things. First one, he talks about federal installations, including, remember I told you a couple forts remained, and he laid out, in your hands, my dissatisfied countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without yourself being the aggressors. So it makes it very clear the South will start this civil war. It is you who was starting it, not the North, the South. He needed the South to be the aggressors. And then he finished with a very much a path to reconciliation. I am loath to close the speech. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be by the better angels of our nature. So he's saying in this, we are too close. Remember, that's why I showed you how they are actually very similar. And he says the mystic cords of memory, and they're stretching from every battlefield or patriot grave, we have the same history. We're the same people. We should not be fighting. The Union must be preserved. But he's also making it very clear, with the better angels of our nature, but it's you in the South that will start it. And so, yeah, he's trying to bring the South in. But add this, in his first inaugural address, he's speaking to the North. We represent Union in the North. They are the rebels. It'd be great if the South could come back, but he's telling the North, we must be unified. This will be spoken time after time again, as Lincoln, sometimes the South would use this after the war, trying to reconcile with the South and bring the South in. In many ways, he's telling the North, we're the good guys here. We're the good guys, not them. Lincoln's a hard man. He is a tough person. And people forget this because of the nature of his sudden death and would turn into a martyr. He was a hard politician and knew he had to use every trick in the book. There are few people that would manipulate more than Abraham Lincoln. But that's his first inauguration. And so Lincoln, the free soiler, but he is also desperate to preserve the Union. Lincoln wants to preserve the Union because he wants this to be a free soil nation. And so here's two views of Lincoln's inauguration. It's a great cartoon. Lincoln is the way the North saw him as. And so the North could say, Lincoln wants peace. Yet the South looks at it as Lincoln as the god of war. Good cartoon. And so there we get Lincoln. When he says it, Lincoln, Union, Union, Union. And the South must fire first. That is what we get, the main essence. Now, don't forget, the war is about the Southern view. They must protect slavery. Yet Lincoln is scared to do this. And yes, it was a 13-year-old girl who wrote Lincoln a letter after he was elected president saying, you would look better with a beard. So he grew a beard. So that is the Lincoln we see. And he did not have a beard before he became president. So when he showed up in Washington, D.C., beard. And you notice they ignored slavery. Slavery, Lincoln did not want to bring slavery up because when he was inaugurated, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas had not joined the Confederacy. And he doesn't want to push it. And he doesn't want to push northern states to be divided over slavery yet, even though they all know slavery is behind the Southern reasoning to start this. Here is his cabinet. You do not need to know all of his cabinet. Blair at the Navy. Where's Gideon Wells of the Navy or a post office. Cameron right here is the war. These are the ones you have to know though. Right here. Salmon Chase. Chase of New York was the Treasury Secretary. And William Seward was the State Secretary, Secretary of State. Seward and Chase were the two most prominent Republicans in his cabinet. And they were two men who wanted to be president. Chase of New York was kind of an iffy former Whig who Lincoln saw as a real threat. Part of the reason he made him Treasury is Lincoln wanted the enemy in his house, not outside the house. And Seward of Ohio also wanted to be president. He was made a state secretary, and he would be a real rival. Seward and Chase both believed that Lincoln was inherently weak and they would dominate Lincoln. They would be quite surprised. One more person we have to get is right here. Oh, you have to write him down. Simon Cameron of Pennsylvania was considered a pretty corrupt former Whig who became the Secretary of War. Lincoln didn't want him, but it was a deal they made to get Lincoln the nomination. But as soon as Lincoln could, he fired Cameron. So Chase and Seward, and the one we need to know is at the War Department, a name you cannot read. Sorry about that. Edwin Stanton. And he would become to personify the War Department. Hard-bitten former Democrat would become the Secretary of War, and that's why Mars as Stanton. And Stanton would become an incredibly controversial character. And then after the war, he'd be responsible for Reconstruction. So just a few more things before we finish. Thus, we get to the Civil War. So we went through all the start of it, all the events that led to it, and here's the Civil War. And this is a great picture right after the Battle of Antietam. The bloodiest single day in American history, at least when it comes to combat. Some of the COVID days have caught this, and the Galveston flood, or Galveston hurricane, 100 years ago, 8,000 people died in one day. But back to this. Here's Lincoln talking to a very important general by the name of George McClellan. We'll get to McClellan. And a good picture that does relate to Montana. because one of McClellan's aides was recent West Point graduate who finished last in his class, George Armstrong Custer, right there. So good picture. So Fort Sumter, the last thing for today, Fort Sumter, I think the last thing, was out in the middle of Charleston Bay. It's one of the couple federal installations, the other one was off of Pensacola, that the Union did not evacuate. There were a few forts around Charleston Bay, like Fort Moultrie and Mount Pleasant, Fort Johnson. The United States evacuated a few hundred soldiers to the unfinished masonry fort at Fort Sumter. And so it's a brick fort. Basically, it was just a sandbar. They built it up and built a fort on it. And it's unfinished. And there they remained all through January, February, into March. Buchanan thought about sending a resupply mission, just food, no weapons, just food. Lincoln continued it. A ship called the Star of the West was on its way. And so a resupply mission, just food. But the South knew food, they could stay indefinitely unless they want war. So the South sent an ultimatum. Before the ship could arrive, surrender. The Southern ultimatum, surrender. And so here is the point. And Lincoln is kind of stuck. Lincoln continues the peaceful resupply mission, but knows he has no choice but to send a resupply. A surrender will be humiliating. And so out here in the middle of the bay is this fort. There's the American flag. Here's a picture soon afterwards, and you'll notice the Confederate flag flying in the wind. And so on April 12th, with the Star of the West, the resupply mission just within sight, the Confederates opened fire. Here's headlines of the New York Times. And I like it's called Fort Sumter, but everyone called it Sumter. So you see a couple different spellings of it. They opened fire. Now, Confederate guns, many of them former Union guns that they just took when the Unions abandoned their installations, they had not very much training. They were actually always short of powder. So most of the shells missed. Here shows a dramatic shelling of it, but most missed. In fact, as the Union Army huddled in their bomb proofs, nobody was, there were no casualties. No men were killed or wounded. One horse and one man were killed when a Confederate gun blew up. The shelling began. And by the way, Fort Pickens, that's the fort off of Pensacola. That would remain in Union hands. Major Robert Anderson was the commander in Fort Sumter, and he had a situation that was completely untenable. He couldn't survive, but he's there in Fort Sumter. He had just a few hundred men and very limited powder. The Confederate commander was a man they made a general of the Confederate Army, a Louisiana general named Pierre Gustave Toussaint Beauregard. Everybody called him PGT Beauregard. Anderson was a teacher at West Point before the war. And one of his students was a brilliant engineering student, engineering important to aim cannon. One of his most important, or one of his best students was PGT Beauregard. Very small army. So Beauregard opened fire, and after all day of shelling, Anderson fired a couple shells back or anything else to show he's still there. And then he had no choice but to surrender Sumter. Here is Sumter. Okay, this is from Harper's Weekly showing the Confederate guns. And so when I went to Charleston the first time, I just assumed Charleston was, or Fort Sumter was just right there. Actually, it's just a tiny speck from Charleston. And, you know, the perspective is something else. But they surrendered and Fort Sumter fell. Here is, just one sec. Here is Sumter after the battle. Here's Sumter after it was taken. And, sorry, I have to type something real fast. I want to do the live. God, this is so annoying. I'm sorry I got to get rid of the pointer. I know the creative process is fun. So with that, so Sumter fell. They played a song called My Bonnie Blue Flag, but you can see here, and let me go back just a little bit, right here. That is the Confederate flag. That's the Confederate flag. And they decided to go with this. This is a new version of the Confederate flag. It's very much based on the Confederate, or on the flag of Texas. And they kept the red, white, and blue. And so in some way, this would be the flag till near the end of the war for the Confederacy. This is the flag that's known as the Stars and the Bars. And here's the original one with the seven stars of the Confederacy. But after Sumter, other states joined. So eventually they would have 11. Here's a flag from the very beginning of the war. The Stars and the Bars. The result of Sumter and the surrender at Sumter would be a unified North and the South. The North unified for Union, and the South, this brought in the Upper South. Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia joined the Confederacy. They joined the Confederacy. Oops. And I should have typed this in. This is another one. I would do something a little bit differently when we had a normal school day. That's why I'm a little bit off here. Richmond, Virginia became the capital. Richmond, Virginia. And the amazing thing about that is Richmond is only about 100 miles or less than 100 miles from Washington, D.C. And so the main focus of the war is going to be right there and along the rivers. And almost immediately, we're going to jump right to, that's where we'll quit. I just looked at the clock. I'm sorry, I kept going. So I'm quitting right there. We'll do a little bit of the Battle of Bull Run and 1862 tomorrow. I am going to post, or on Friday, remember tomorrow's the DBQ. I'm going to post we got to do a little bit of assignment over Christmas. I will post that after school today, or after I'm done with this. I'm going to Western Civ now after this. And I'm going to do a few things, but I will post that. It's a couple chapters, a map, and a little bit of a reading. It's just the way it is. There'll be a quiz when you get back. I'm sorry, but we got to do it. I'm not really that sorry. Okay, and you like the birds? I was in Costa Rica. Okay, so with that, we're going to quit for today. If there's no additional questions, this will be posted as an assignment for tomorrow. And so on that, if you have any questions about the DBQ, please ask, and I will see you tomorrow.
Bye, thank you.